Um, yes. Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Hoang Nhan Vo, and he's currently based in Germany, in Bonn, I believe, and does studies a lot of military history and politics. Welcome, Hoang, to the podcast.
Thank you, Larry. Should I introduce myself now? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, just introduce yourself and what you're doing and daily basis.
As he said, I'm Hoang Nhan Vo. I'm a Vietnamese, German Vietnamese from Cologne, but I studied military history in Bonn, and I still do my PhD there. And I specialize in military researches about Asia and Europe, about the exchange of military technology and ideas around the 17th and 16th century, when the first contact of Asia and Europe during the uh, age of expedition in Europe, when the European meets the Asians in Japan, China, Vietnam, and so on. And therefore, there had been some exchanges in military technology, scientists, and economics. And this is what I researched actually, how they influenced themselves during the greatest war at this time, in the Sengoku period in Japan, and in the 30 Years Wars in Europe, how these two major wars in Europe and Asia influenced themselves by the introduction of knowledge of both cultures.
So, it's about an expansion of the scientific knowledge that comes with fighting wars for the most part. There are some positive spillover effects like
Yeah,
that.
yes. For example, the European armies were based on noblemen who fought on horsebacks, and therefore the armies was very little at the end of the 14th, 15th century. And by expanding the war in the 16th century during the Confession Wars, or in the 30 Years Wars, for example, they needed more bigger army in order to maintain this conquest. And so they have to shift their organization forms in Europe. And at that time, for example, the Japanese were fighting a war for almost in the end almost 100 years, and had developed their society in order to create from a noble society who fought the war into a society which included every person in the society into the war, by bringing the peasants into the war machinery and organize them into a military structure. And that, in kind of, the European learned from the Asian warfare systems of Japan and China at this time.
Yeah, so you mentioned the importance of the peasantry, so I mean, my notion of warfare historically is that you need to have the peasants to produce the food supplies, because if you have a large army that you have to sustain, you have to pay. The king has to pay the army to fight, and so you would tax the peasants in order to, I suppose, undertake these conquests. Um, uh, but at some point there was a shift to its mass conscription, right?
Yes.
That you that it was not enough to have like aristocracy, like noblemen, to on the horsebacks, fighting all of these campaigns.
Exactly. For, to be specific, the European had modern ways of conscription in the past before, in the ancient time, like the Romans or the Greeks. But during the Middle Ages, this has shifted to a feudal system where only the nobleman society are fighting short wars and with countable number, with little numbers of men. This has been shifted because after the fall of the Roman Empire in Europe, the societies were not sustained enough to sustain big armies. So they can become little smaller parts. The kingdoms become smaller. The organization structures became more little, and so the king and the influences of kings in the Middle Ages in Europe, for example, become less important than, for example, the power of an emperor in Roman society. So they couldn't afford to create big armies. In order of that, they had to create little armies with noblemen who are allegiance to their cause and help them out. And so the war became more little. And in the 16th and 17th century, the governments of the European kingdoms become centralized again and become more powerful. In order to maintain their power, they had to build up bigger army. And now there's a question how they maintain bigger army again and construct the hierarchy and the organization of their country in order to maintain a bigger army to expand their kingdoms. And at that time, they learned a lot from Asian warfare systems as well, because the Japanese and the Chinese warfare system maintained much larger armies, and the European have to learn how to create this system to maintain bigger army and do supply these armies as well. And this is what I research, especially in my PhD work now.
Right. And so is there also a logic that, the bigger the army, the more likely, you are to win it? And so I only have a very rudimentary understanding of like military history, but like for the Jared Diamond retelling of history, you have kind of this guns, germs, and steel argument where the Europeans were able to conquer the world effectively because they were in continuous warfare with each other, and they were able to improve their military technology over time, and you could keep refining the military technology, largely because there are so many countries in relatively small amount of space, and so like you had one war that's going on and then it stops, and then 10 years later there's a new dispute, and then you fight a new war. And so basically, if you were like a part of the military industrial complex, your order books would be full all the time, and you would continuously get better at developing new technologies. Like I would say, for instance, the European armies that are the most war capable at this point is the Ukrainian and the Russian army, because they are fighting the active battle, and they're developing new striking capabilities, new drones, and all of these things.
Yes,
yeah. So what is your thought about? Basically, I mean, the big question of history, right? So how is it that the West, comes to rule the world?
Yeah, I agree that one part of the answer to this question is that the European fought a lot of war against each other, and so far they become better in warfare at some specific time during the Middle Ages to the modern ages, when they have fought a religious war. But in Asia, at the 16th and 17th century, there was a similar period of warfare in Asia, the Sengoku period, for example, in Japan, and you can compare it to the complied with the European warfare. The small kingdoms have fought with each other for centuries, and in this period, the Japanese did the same, and they fought in a more closer way because was the only island of Japan where Japan has become split into little local feudal lords who fought for dominance. And because they fought for 100 years, they developed a lot of new tactics and strategies and warfare routines. And this is what. And when the European came to Japan, they inspired. They saw a country very developed in this area of warfare because the people there fought for centuries, for decades now, and that they could learn from, because in Europe at that time there was a short period of peace where the armies were not that developed. We say that Japan at 1600 was the excuse me, was the most modern army at the world at that time, because they were successful in including their peasants into a very capable war structure, which was able to invade Korea as well at that time.
Yeah, and so you're talking about the period of around 1600s, and yeah, so there are like important warlords, right, in Japan, right? Tokugawa,
Yep.
Ieyasu, right? Nobunaga order, and yeah, so yeah, so yeah, so I was asking about earlier about the Japanese social structure, and you briefly described it, which was about, you know, feudalism, and yeah. So, what was the circumstance in which these, you know, great Japanese, you could say, warlords were able to generate so many resources to fight each other for supremacy?
We have to understand the Japanese feudal system at first. The Japanese feudal system was based on lords, where the lords were based from a noble family, and these family were become in the 13th century pushed back the authority of the Japanese emperor and became shoguns. And these feudal warlords were military warlords at the time. And this title of shogun was an inherited title, which was given to the members of this family for generation until in the modern age, in the 19th century, with the Boshin War, where they were finally defeated. And the reason why they were able to feed that many soldiers were because at that time the economic situation of Japan was a very good one. They had modernized their technology to produce rice, and at that time the society were growing a lot. The population were rising by 200% from last decade to the next decade, because of the rice production technology at the time that was increasing, and so there was not so many peasants needed for this work anymore, and they also include women for the work in the farming society as well. And because Japan was the warlords were fighting small wars at the borders. There were conscript like in the winter to spring, they make the harvest, and in summer they fight, and in autumn they return back to their land to make the harvest again. And the military construction of the fielding of the Japanese armies were based on the period where the peasants were not troubled with farming issues in this time, and they were also how they get so many people because of this feudal structure. As a peasant, normally you don't have the reason or power to rise up the society. When you're born as a peasant, you will stay as a peasant. But in service of a feudal lord, if you serve as a peasant soldier, you could rise up the social ladder. And this was a reason why a lot of peasants had a reason to go to the armies of the feudal lords as well. And in the other kinds is they were forced to serve in their feudal armies.
Yeah. So there was, for a peasant who fought on behalf of the lord, there would be compensation, right? So and there, was it the case that a soldier or a veteran's material life was better than somebody who stayed a peasant throughout?
Yes, it was better, but in what difference the Japanese feudal system and warfare system of paying the soldiers was they were paid with food and materials and not with money or gold. And this, so if you serve in the army of the Lord, you get a bunch of sack of rice, for example. So it was very much cheaper to equip a feudal Japanese peasant than in Europe with a feudal soldier where you have to pay him money, coins, to serve. And this was a enhancement to the European. When the Europeans start to field larger army, they have to shift by paying with coin and money instead of with food.
And I guess the preference to either of these two kinds of payments, I guess it depends on how developed the money economy is. Because if you have a very developed money economy and you can have a wide array of the commodities that you can purchase on the market,
Yes.
then I would say that the money payment is much preferable.
Yes, I think so too. But in Japan at that time, the money was saved from the lords was morally safe in order to buy products from foreign countries, for example. Was centralized. The money was more centralized. So they keep their money for exchange with the foreign countries, and they pay their armies with food because they have overproduction of food at that time.
Right, and I think that makes sense because were there also periods of food uncertainty, right? Where, let's say, if you have 1 year where the harvest was especially bad and the peasants do not have enough savings of like grain storage, and so they would rely upon the payment that they receive as soldiers in the army, right? So it is an insurance feature.
Asian military society, from the ancient time to the feudal time at the 16th, 14th, 15th century, they were often paid with food and naturals than with money because, for example, the Mongol Empire, for example, they were nomad society, and in their society there was gold and so on, but there was not a lot of products that they can buy with it in the Mongol desert or steppes, as for example. And so becoming an owner of horses and sheep and so on was more preferable payment for Mongolian soldiers for the time, for example.
Yeah, because the sheep would be used mainly for the nutrition, I suppose, right?
Yes.
And also warmth. And I mean, so I mean, in military history, I mean, the people that were so greedy for the gold mines, I would think of are the Spaniards, right?
Yeah.
So the original motivation of people like Christopher Columbus, to go into the Americas and explore the Americas, which they originally called India, right? We still have the label the West Indies because I think there was a belief that they were finding a new route to South Asia.
Yes.
And so the motivation for the most part was that they found the gold deposits, right, in Central America.
Yeah.
And-
This was the motivation for the noble ones in Europe, I think, more than the peasants in Europe. But
because the
one,
noblemen, they wanted to have a store of value, right?
yeah,
That was the idea. That
yes.
they could,
The other issue why the European expand to the rest of the world was one that after these devastating wars in the 16th, 15th century about religion and so on, they figured out that war in Europe was not profitable because it was devastating their economy and devastating and the great kingdoms like England, Spain, and France are all equally powerful, and so conquest wouldn't be that profitable because they couldn't conquer large countries. So in that time, I think this was a reason why they focused their conquest to other countries as well, outside Europe as well, because they were not that developed and much easier to be attacked and conquered.
right. So that goes back to this guns, germs, and steel argument, right? Where if effectively, I mean, so the guns would be the main dividing line, right? Because if you think about how these Spanish conquerors were able, they were like maybe one or two to ride into Mesoamerica and I guess was it the Incas and the Aztecs, and they were able to basically capture an entire piece of territory with a much larger population. But I would say the guns are important, but I would also say the diseases cannot be underestimated because I think that it was 95% was the death rate, I think, upon the first contact. And yeah,
I think that is the most valuable issue why they were able to conquer it because of the diseases. Because of the diseases, the population of Latin America wasn't able to develop the resistance against the European at that time.
Well, I guess it would be pre-Latin. I would say that there would be it was a Native American, so to speak, right? Populations. And yeah, so this was a major imbalance. Then the other example that I found interesting in world history was the Khoisan people in I guess the southern part of Africa, and you had the expansion of the Bantu population, which is nowadays I guess sub-Saharan African, and the Khoisan were also wiped out with diseases, right, by the Bantus. The Bantus were at that time already like agriculture based, I suppose, and the Khoisan were still closer to like hunter-gatherer in terms of the social structure. So in kind of this large-scale contest, I mean, you could say, I mean, if you were to impose the Marxist framework, right? Could you say that the agriculture feudalist system is going to be superior to the hunter-gatherer system, and then the capitalistic, commercial, industrial, you could say, side is going to be more powerful than the feudal agricultural system?
I would say yes, but I would say this is the way of the development of human society in economic terms.
Yeah, but it has an impact. I mean, so the economic structure, I mean, has an impact on the kinds of wars that can be fought, right?
Yes, of course. If we see, you are from Chinese countries, and at the Ming Dynasty, there was a time where the Ming Dynasty has established and was sophisticated in the country, and there was a long time of peace. And there, the Ming Dynasty started to expand to other countries as well. They had to build up the grand sea fleet to discover other parts of the world for a short period of time. You know that period?
So you're referring again to the Ming period?
Ming He was the admiral who.
Oh yeah, Zheng He, right? Yeah. Yeah, this was an important time period, and kind of the big question that is then being raised about, why the West rules and not China, which was also a major civilization. I think that the experiences of Zheng He is always the one that people go back to.
I was curious about it because they had the same historical similarity as the European. They expand to the other areas of the world and was successful, and this helped them to develop furthermore. And this was where in history, I think the time of imperialism and colonialism was a very successful period for the European countries. But I was always wondering why China didn't experience that success, like when they expand to the American and African and European countries under the command of Zheng He. The Ming Emperor didn't see that as a success to be continued. After one generation, they, as I read the documents, they destroyed the great Ming fleet because it wasn't profitable for Chinese main country. And I was always wondering why they came to this conclusion, because in the other way around, the European were very successful by exploiting other countries.
Okay, so here I'm going back to this Philip Hoffman argument about military competition, and so he develops what's called the tournament model of you could say military conquest, and the idea is that think of every war as being like a build up to the next war, right? So you succeed in this war, and so you develop new means to win the next war, or even if you lose the war, you still have to reconstitute your armies and fight again for another day. And this was constantly ongoing in the European case because, as you said, you have the big powers like Germany, UK, France that were about of equal strength. And in China it wasn't like that. So you had the consolidation of power for the most part. There were periods where like Three Kingdom period and things like that, where there was extended divisions, but largely even in the Ming period, I think there was, for the most part, unity throughout much of the Chinese domains. So there was less of this military tournament model that was ongoing. And then the second factor is, well, I mean, I should then make a 180 to what I just said earlier, because there was some amount of conflict that was happening at the edges of the Ming dynasties, of the Ming Empire. So I'm referring to the Jurchen people, the Manchurians, right? That eventually, I mean, they at the beginning they were just a nuisance, and then eventually they were like a real threat, and they overthrew the Ming Empire eventually.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I mean, if you look at the geography of China, where basically you have this whole area north of that the Great Wall, that was basically a constant frontier against the wide open steppe, you know, where the Mongols lived and the Jurchens, and it was a constant struggle to defend those external borders. And so I think at some point, you know, the Ming emperors kind of came to this belief that this kind of shipbuilding and trading overseas was going to be a hassle and a waste of resources compared to shoring up the northern border to keep out the so-called barbarians. And so yeah, so they never got around to this idea that the Europeans developed, which is, I mean, it's a mixture of like military domination, right? Like wanting to defeat and conquer other places, but then also integrating into global markets, integrating into global economy, you know, trading, you know, with kind of this Ricardian, you know, competitive advantage logic, right? You know, exploiting the colonies for the resources that then benefit the home consumer market, etc. Those, you know, this kind of like mercantilist, military expansionist logic, I believe, is unique to the Western European model. You know, I don't think that at the time of the Ming Dynasty that this idea was very strongly developed. Just one more citation here. I think Ding Xinjiao, he's a sociologist based in Chicago, and he wrote this one book chapter where he was kind of arguing that, so he's an expert on the, you know, Confucian bureaucratic state. So, you know, how with China building up the bureaucracy over thousands of years. And he was very much convinced that it was the Western imperialism that brought China into what we call the modern world, right?
Yes.
So really, I mean, we're talking about the period of around, you know, the 19th century, probably early 19th century, under the Qing dynasty, when the when, like the merchants, the missionaries of the West, right, and then of course supported by the soldiers, the armies, were going into China. There was the Opium War, there was the Boxer Rebellion. So there were events that, from the outside, that finally convinced the Chinese political leadership that this sort of isolationist, you know, feudalistic system that really defined the Confucian way of thinking, right? If you read like a classic Confucian text, I mean, it was like modeled on this like feudalist society, right? Like the peasants has to be obedient and paid taxes to the Lord, and the Lord was given instructions as to how to, optimize grain production and things like that. So, so that was broken up only with the Western interference.
In conclusion, would you say the domination of China in the 15th, 16th, 17th century during Ming and Qin dynasty was one reason why the development of Asia in technology and society and so on was stopped in some kind of way, and the European were, because they were in action war and in race with each other in economy and so on, they could overthrow the Asian societies in that kind of regards because of the long period of peace in Europe, in Asia, while because of Ming Dynasty dominance in Asia.
Yeah, I think that would be a statement of historical fact, simply, right? That the Asians, I think, I don't know, so I'm still very fascinated by these geography-focused accounts, where, because I mean, if you look at the map of Europe, I mean, yes, I mean, so you have internal boundaries, right? Think of like the Alps, for instance. Or think of the shapes of, like, the Italian peninsulas and Scandinavia and so forth. But it is still largely an integrated space, because the distances between these nation states is quite minimal. So there's just more opportunities for warfare. There's more opportunities for internal travel, like exchange of ideas, universities, and so forth. I don't know how much of that was happening within the Asian space. I mean, I could only think of like the Japanese scholars that went to China during the Tang Dynasty in the 7th to 10th century, which is why there are some similarities in the way that the Japanese set up the bureaucracies to the Chinese system. Also the writing system, right, which was adopted from the Tang period. So there was some amount of that policy learning that was happening. But I don't know. I think that but there's something about, I think, the geographic proximity of these European countries that allow for more flourishing economic, military, and scientific developments to happen.
They influence each other in Europe more than in Asia, and I think this has something to do with their history, which is connected in some way, because they were in one time they were all part of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire shifted and how do you say it in German? In German, I have a word, but I don't know the word in English.
Well, I could help translate it for you if you don't want to.
Yeah, okay, Moment. I will think the sentence in German and then tell it to you, and you can translate it in English. Die Europäer haben eine gemeinsame Geschichte durch das Römische Reich, und dieses Römische Reich durch die lateinische Sprache und römische Kultur verbindet die ganzen europäischen Länder, Deutschland, Frankreich, England, Spanien, auf eine bestimmte Weise miteinander, dass sie, auch wenn sie Krieg miteinander führen, irgendwie sich zusammengehörig fühlen. Und dieses Gefühl ist, glaube ich, in Asien nicht so gegeben, weil es eine dominante chinesische Macht gab, aber sie hatte nie komplette Kontrolle über die anderen asiatischen Ländern gehabt, sodass man irgendwie zurückguckt als auf eine gemeinsame Geschichte in einer Art und Weise, wie es die Europäer mit der römischen Geschichte tun.
Right. So you're saying that the Romans, they had a common language and a common culture, right? So the idea is that Latin is the basis of European cultures, and in the Asia Pacific sphere, you have a quite dominant power, which is China, in relation to the Mongols, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Japanese, etc. But it was not a completely unified sphere. I mean, so aside from Confucianism, I mean, I would think of like Buddhism, which actually originated from India,
Yes.
which then spread into China and also Thailand, like Southeast Asia. Um, so there were some ideas that were somewhat unifying across that vast geographic space. But like, but it's not as tightly as what the Greco-Roman plus the Christian, right? So if you merge the Christian culture with the Greco-Roman, it seems like it's a much more tightly integrated unit regarding the legal system, regarding the languages, and so forth, right?
For example, when you study law in Europe, you start with Roman law. This is the base of the law system in Europe and in the modern Western world in some kind of way. And in my opinion, if you were let's say you were a French nobleman and you met a German nobleman, each other were equal in some way because they shared a same history. They say they came from Charlemagne and the Roman Empire and so on and so forth. And even if they are at war with each other, they have a codex of culture, common culture from based on the Roman and the Christian societies. And in Asia, China was dominant, and China didn't see the other countries around them as equal and called them mostly barbarians. And this is an idea that splits society, the Asian society, in contrast to the European at the time, I would say.
Yeah, so if I can go back to like a more contemporary headline I saw yesterday, which was quite interesting. It was so you have the new Japanese government, the new Japanese prime minister, and he said that that the Asian countries outside of China should form a NATO-style military alliance.
Yes.
And that would be a significant paradigm shift, because right now the Asia Pacific military security structure is based on bilateral military agreements with the United States, right? So it's like Japan and US, and then South Korea, US, etc.
It was the idea of CETO, but this was never developed like NATO, I guess.
Yeah, and yeah, so there have been some attempts in the past. I mean, you could make the argument that ASEAN, those 10 countries represented in it, they were formed in response to Indochina, like Vietnam and Cambodia, etc., being communist, and the idea was you had to stop it right there, right? So Thailand was kind of the next country up the line, and the Malaysians, the Singaporeans, I know for sure they were very concerned about the spread of communism in the 1970s and beyond. But yeah, so the historic origin of ASEAN was about anti-communism, and then if you make it about anti-communism, then by implication it was about generating security alliances with the United States, right? And so, but then there's a big question as to, like, if you wanted to do an Asian NATO, I mean, let's call it the Pacific Alliance, like, how would that happen? And also, like, does the United States have an interest to retain this commitment, this kind of leadership, the investments that you have to make as a global hegemon? Because if you think about the discourse around TPP, right, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which originally, I mean, it was, we make it about the trade deals among the Asia-Pacific countries, including the United States, and the US being the biggest country would take the leadership in those negotiations. That was the Obama administration position. Then Trump came in, and then he said, well, we'll pull out of the TPP. And then Japan said they were going to take the leadership role, and they would have a slimmed down version of it. But I mean, if the Japanese were to envision kind of this specific military alliance, I mean, the first question would be raised is like, okay, which Pacific countries would want to join, and secondly, I mean, who is going to take the leadership position? I would think that without the US, there would be no credibility, right?
Yes, I think so too, because all the countries around China are too small to act on their own, and if they do create a NATO-like CETO organization without the US, it would match. I think the NATO in Europe wouldn't be successful as it is without US as well, and that's because in Asia the countries were always, if you want to create a military alliance, you need an enemy or something like that to give them a reason to unite. And in Europe there was the Soviet Union threat, and China at most time in the past wasn't a threat to the Asian communities at the 70s and 60s, I think. But nowadays it could be more and more a threat to the Asian communities. And
well, I mean, they were a threat to Vietnam, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s, right? So
yeah, that's sure, but not a great threat to other countries like Japan or something like that. They hadn't got some interest in invading Japan or something like that. This was what I want to say. But nowadays they are a threat, and for all around Asia. And this was what I was wondering about. The Japanese tried in the Second World War. They tried to create a Asian Commonwealth, I would say. They wanted to dominate Asia and build Asia to a political and economic powerhouse in the East to match European and compete with the European and the US at that time. And because they made it, but they forced it with brutality and military force, and this wasn't successful. But I think the idea is a good one if it would be achieved in a peaceful way, like the European Union united together in a way to develop economy and welfare together. And if I last year I traveled Asia, and when I speak with the people there, in the media we have tensions like the Japanese and the North Korean and Japanese and China and in the Taiwanese question and so on, military tensions and so on. But I have the feeling that the people in Asia nowadays, because of influence of the wealth growing and so on, and connecting each other more and more through globalized economy, they like each other. And in my opinion, there is no reason why Asia couldn't create a new Asian Union or something like that, except for historical reasons and the threat of China because of the Xi Jinping wants to conquer his surroundings and being a threat to other countries around him.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the Europeans developed this notion that after a big war you can pacify the entire region, the entire continent, right? And I would say that basically the formation of the European Union and the Franco-German alliance that was at the base of it, I would say it's kind of it's like a historical fluke almost, right? Which is to say that it's very rare that such a thing can happen. Versus, I think that what's happening in Asia is that the last big war, so I suppose when Japan conquered the Asia Pacific space in World War II, it might be so far back in history that that these old animosities between those countries could essentially flare up again. And there's not necessarily, I don't know, as much of this historical awareness and historical regret, certainly not among the Japanese society, right? So like in a way, like in especially like West Germany, I think there was this, they went out of their way to apologize for the Holocaust and for World War II. And in Japan, it's kind of like, well, these are war heroes, right? And we have to pay respect to them. And then on the Chinese side, there's also a lot of nationalism that surrounds like opposing Japan for the most part.
Would you say that nationalism is in Asia a phenomena of the modern age, or would you say nationalism is an issue from the past already? Like in Europe, we say nationalism wasn't existing until this 18th, 19th century, where the countries become national states. And in Asia, I think, because of the dominance of China in the past, nationalism was developed much earlier than in Europe. And I would say this is an issue which hollows the Asian communities now until nowadays in order to create alliances like European Union.
Right. And so, are you saying that, so if you have like a long-term attachment to nationalistic ideas,
yes,
then it makes you less willing and interested to join military alliances, especially with those other Asian countries. I suppose they're okay with a bilateral alliance with the US, right? Complete, cultural outsider from the Asian perspective. Yeah, we can, work with them, but but we'd still have a hard time working
with each
with
other.
the other Asian countries.
I would say that when creating NATO, it was critical that the US was the leading power of these alliances, because after World War II there was still some issues about France and Germany, for example. There were, for hundreds of years, there were arch enemies, or England and France during the Napoleonic Wars, and this rivalry was still intact after the World War, and so it was a very good decision to give the leading role to a country outside of Europe, so they don't need to compete with each other in dominance of this alliance in Europe, and this was the one key role of success of the NATO alliance after World War II, and the threat of the Soviet Union, also, of course, as well.
Right, and so that raises the issue of, like, the way how, especially like in Germany, I mean, they regard Trump and the Trump phenomenon as a threat, right? Because it is at least rhetorically. I mean, it's not maybe directly in terms of the policy actions in his first term in office, but certainly in terms of his rhetorical framing that basically that NATO is a financial burden for the United States, and that it should be offloaded to the Europeans. That in fact even the Ukraine war is largely a European problem, and I just listened to the podcast yesterday with Ramaswamy, who was one of the Trump allies, and he has a very weird kind of logic, right? Which is that that the reason why Ukraine must be sacrificed to the Russians is to prevent a closer Russian-Chinese alignment, and that if the United States wanted to weaken China, they had to make concessions to Russia, to whatever the Kremlin demands within their sphere of influence. And to me, I mean, this is a very flawed logic, because like, what would stop? I mean, so hypothetically, so the Russians take over the whole of Ukraine. At that point, what is going to stop them from continuing, military alliance with, or not alliance, but alignment with China, right? And continuing to menace on the eastern flank in NATO.
Nothing, actually, and we see they have some, China and Russia, India, and so on. They have some alliance, economic alliance like BRICS or something like that, which bond the tide between these countries. And if the US wants to divide them, they have to do otherwise than must make concession to the Russia, I think, to the Russians. I think, in my opinion, I think the US has to strengthen the alliances with their historical allies and find a way to divide these powers like Russia and China in order to keep their dominion, if they want so. So in this case, I think supporting Ukraine will weaken the Russian and Chinese alliances, because they struggle in this war as well. And I think it comes to the point which society can endure this more.
Yeah, and right now, I mean, we are creating more and more messy conflicts in the world. I'm referring here to, I think, like this morning's headline was that, the Israelis were striking a Russian air base in Syria, and which the Russians had been there for, I guess, more than a decade to support the Assad regime, which is still in power. And the Russians and Syrians are effectively, I mean, collaborating with Hezbollah and with Iran, right? And essentially, I mean, there's like more fires that are getting laid around the world, in which in which the U.S. is kind of more and more like a passive force, right? Where it's like you can only react to it. It's like you can only react to it by basically calibrating your level of support to Ukraine and to Israel, right?
Yes.
But effectively, I mean, those fires are like raging more and more, and there is, yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, there's a lack of leadership capacity within the U.S.
Would you say all these crisis happens because of the weakness of the American politic in their own country? Because this dividation in the politics of US leads to this passive role in the world ruling period.
Yeah, I mean, I think it cannot be doubted. I mean, I just read the snippets of the Biden speech at the United Nations where he's basically saying, "I'm retiring. I'm done." So.
For example, when the US was strong, they had a very focused policy to divide the forces against them. For example, in the 80s to the 90s, the foreign politic of the US was to divide China and Russia from each other in order to keep them weak. And they did it by influence China to invite them to world trade, and Russia and so they divided from Russia. And Russia, in the early 90s, there was the time where there was the idea that Russia could become part of the European Union and so on. If this idea would continued, maybe we haven't got this crisis nowadays, where the old enemies were united again against the US.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a big question as to like how much leverage that the U.S. has, because I do think that, I mean, like if you were the astute student of world history, and it was both of us are to some extent, I mean, we know that every empire has ups and downs.
Yes.
And then by downs, I mean, we're talking about terminal declines, not just temporary declines. And so basically, so if you're at the maximum height of power, then you have maximum leverage in terms of like what you can do to influence political outcomes in other regions in the world. And if your empire is in a decline, then it means that the lever that you have, right, is getting smaller and smaller. And so, I mean, my very cautious assessment of kind of presentism would be that the U.S. lever is declining. I'm not saying it's gone completely, right? I mean, you might say it's still there because because the U.S. Navy is still guarding the world's oceans. You could say it's still there because massive military spending, and the dollar is a reserve currency, right? I mean, you saw that like Pakistan and Russia are trading with each other in tangerines, right? Because they're not using dollar, right? because of the sanctions against Russia.
We have to specify declination, because I would say, as a historian and watch the fall of the Roman Empire and so on, and if we watch it in history, we cannot say every decline is the same, because the decline, what happens in the US nowadays, I would not say it is a total decline, but it's only a decline of dividation in the
division
division of the United States in a corner of their politician, and not because they become weak in foreign relations terms.
Right. So okay. So hypothetically, okay. So we have the November election. You're going to have one winner. I mean, either Trump or Harris. And then let's say for the next 3 years at least, they don't have to think about an election right away. And would that 3-year period of that president, would they be able to make a mark, or would they be able to shape the political trajectory of global politics differently than what the Biden administration is doing currently? And I would say, like, so for if Trump came in and he was making serious honest threat to kind of weaken the Western alliance systems, I think that would be a significant shift in terms of like what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Asia, and so forth. But if, let's say, it's going to be like his first term, right, where basically the military advisors were effectively sabotaging the Trump isolationist agenda, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, like there was an order to withdraw troops from Germany, but eventually it didn't happen because the generals just shifted a few units within Germany or something like that. So if there is no massive shift there, then I don't see how a different U.S. administration is going to manage the crisis differently.
When you are united, I think there was a quote from Lord Castlereagh after the Napoleonic Wars. England don't have eternal alliance. England has eternal interests, he once said. And this is a remarkable quote for foreign politician. And I see this quote is legit until today. And this is the reason how the main reason how great powers interact. And for the last decades, if we have a change of presidents in the United States, like from Kennedy to and so on, until the modern time, even if you come from the opposite party, you keep the foreign policy of the United States mostly straight the same. They didn't shift their interests in foreign politics, but now that it happened, and this is why I see some issues for the weakness of American foreign politics nowadays.
So there's a weakness in the U.S. foreign policy, and it's something that has to be observed, and you'll have to see what can be done about it. But again, but I'm still quite pessimistic as to, like, what the U.S. Can do and wants to do. I mean, so there's also complexity with with regard to Ukraine versus Israel, because I think in the Ukrainian case, I think it's much clearer that that I think more should be done in order to stop the Russian onslaught. I mean, they took Volodar, they're very close to Pokrovsk, and after that town falls, I mean, it's going to be much easier to capture the lowlands, west of Donetsk. So it doesn't look too good in my view. I mean, because also the Ukrainians, I mean, they have issues with the manpower, like how long do their own people want to fight this war? With Israel, however, I mean,
But I
my
would
worries.
this issue as well. I doubt that the Russian losses don't inflict Russian politics in that case. That a fatigue in the Russian society is increasing as well, I think.
Yeah, and I guess like what would make every analyst superbly rich if they were able to predict it was like who's going to buckle first. And well, because I mean, so far, I mean, the burden on the Ukrainians is significantly larger because it is part of the Russian war strategy to destroy the physical infrastructure, like the power plants and gas turbines, etc., in Ukraine, and thereby making civilian life quite intolerable under those circumstances. So, so the amount of deprivation that is inflicted on the Ukrainian civilians is significantly larger than what's happening on the other side. Yeah, what's happening in Russia is, I suppose, like some groups that don't like to serve in the army or have like their family members being sacrificed. I think that would be probably one lever. The other one is that yes, I think that inflation on like food and daily products in Russia is now higher than it was before the war, and it does maybe remind them of the period of the 1990s, which was a period of significant inflation and political instability.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's kind of the $1 million question: who's going to buckle first? But again, I think all that the West can do. I think I think they should permit the deep strike capabilities into the Russian military bases and ammunition storage sites. That I think this kind of red line debate, both Biden and Olaf Scholz, I think, are still pursuing it. I think it's not justifiable.
Who will buckle first if the Ukraine is allowed to strike military bases in Russia from the Russians, or at least fire rockets near Moscow or something like that, and the people in power of Russia will get shocked by the war itself. Maybe they will buckle sooner.
Right. And there's also some of these like extreme pro-war factions where they're like, well, okay, now we're gonna nuke Ukraine or something like that. But again, I think so. I think that yes, I mean Putin's main motivation is Tsarist imperialism, restore the Soviet Union. But I think an even higher goal for him is just like personal regime survival, right?
Yes.
And I do think that he is calculating that that if he were to trigger the nukes, that NATO could retaliate in such a way that that his regime would be over, right? And
Would
so
would you say he's like Hitler nowadays? He claimed into his power like Hitler did in his last weeks of power in Germany, or would you say Putin is more reasonable?
well, I'm not sure how completely comparable that scenario is, because there was a way to end Hitler's rule, which was basically to take Berlin, right? And I think that option, to take Moscow, is not feasible, neither for the Ukrainians nor for the West. So I think that, I mean, the closest historical analogy I would say would be Tsar Nicholas II. I mean, basically there would have to be some kind of palace coup where somebody within the second row, so it could be one of the Siloviki, one of the military generals, one of the oligarchs, that basically is willing to backstab Putin. I mean, at the moment where, I mean, so I do think like it would have to be combined with like public unrest. So there has to be enough unrest from the people in Moscow and St. Petersburg and large cities. And then you combine that with like a palace coup, and then the new leader would then would be willing to sign a peace agreement with Ukraine, and withdraw the troops.
I think in order to this palace coup, you have to bring the war as next as possible to the people who can be influenced to a palace coup.
Yeah. Well, then there's this other argument that, well, okay, if you attack the Russian civilian population, that they become even more patriotic. I mean, is that kind of a possible reaction? Well,
yeah, I see what you want to say. Then we have only two ways, in my opinion. We have to attack near Russia in order to make them fear. But if you say they make them more patriotics, then we have to defeat them even more on the field in Ukraine. If their economy collapse, this will end the war as soon as well.
yeah. So I think the economic levers, I think those are quite real. I mean, there's this argument that Russia is like an inexhaustible gas station, which is not completely false. I mean, I think they do have, because they're the largest country in the world, territory-wise, they have significant hydrocarbon deposits. Now it's a big question as to like whether they have the sustainable infrastructure, because they do rely on Western engineers and like petroleum engineers and equipment in order to get to those deep underground hydrocarbons storage sites, and I think that kind of energy cooperation is kind of declining. So it doesn't matter like how much hydrocarbon storage you have. I mean, if you cannot get to it, I think that will impact their supplies. They're also one of the largest food exporters in the world, which means they'll be able to feed the population and the soldiers for the long term, for the war.
Yes, this is the I said they could sustain that long, because in the first year of the war, a lot of German militaries and the TV said Russia could only supply this war for 1 year, or at maximum for 1 year. But in my conclusion was the fact that Russia is independent for food and oil and gas and basic economy goods, they were able to sustain this war much longer than expected.
Yeah, I think it's probably a correct assessment. Now, there was this one military analysis I saw, which was about, basically estimating, military equipment shortages, right? That, even if you, so right now, I mean, the Russians are able to feed a significant amount of, tanks and artillery pieces from storage, effectively. And then there's some equipment that is like newly built, right, from the military factories. But I would say the vast majority is still, refurbishment of the old equipment, Soviet equipment.
Yeah, but they are declining in technology. I think more and more they are reliant on older weapons from Soviet Union.
That's right. That's what I was saying. So if they're using very old equipment, and so the good thing about the old equipment is, I mean, we like the military intelligence. I mean, we do have an estimate. We do have a count as to how much Soviet equipment is still in existence, how much of it is being fed to the battlefront. What is the attrition, right, the loss rate of those equipment, and with that, I mean, that Soviet equipment is going to run out, I believe, within a year or two, right? Now then the next question becomes, well, okay, what about the replacement? So let's say the production of new material, because if the production of new material is high enough, then it doesn't matter whether the old Soviet stock is gone.
Yes, but it is, as I know from some papers, they can produce in 1 year. They can produce about 50 or 60 tanks or something like that, but they lost more than 20 tanks a month. The Russians. That's
right.
the reason why they have to sustain from Russian Soviet Union tanks now.
Right. So the replacement with the new tanks, newly built tanks, is going to be way too slow. And so at the point where hypothetically, so if the Russians were to completely draw down on those reserves, then they would have to sue for a ceasefire. I mean, not necessarily an end to the war, but a temporary ceasefire. And that would be, beneficial to some extent, for Ukraine and NATO. I mean, if they themselves were using that ceasefire period to basically re-equip their armed forces, right? And then in that longer contest, I do think that, I mean, that the West is going to be able to beat Russia. Even because, I mean, like, the West has a very diversified economy. I mean, even if we we double military spending right now, but it's still like a modest share of the total economy. I mean, we can still buy all of the civilian stuff that we want, right? Like new computers and cars and things like that, right? And even with a relatively low military spending share, we're able to outproduce Russia. So yeah, I mean, but so that's why I think that the main worry for Ukraine is going to be probably on the manpower side of things. So they have enough of it. The fighting morale, which can flag over many years of fighting. Yeah, and then for the Russians, I mean, I would say morale would be one, and then the other would be the amount of military production. And maybe as the tail end risk, yeah, I mean, like the hydrocarbon, availability.
Yeah, but if we believe the death counts of the Russian military, they will have an issue of sustaining their army as well, of personnel wise, I would say.
Yeah. So because effectively they, I mean, so they are. So the first groups of people that they're drawing down on is the people in the provinces.
Yes.
Right. So I think like Buryatia, right, is one of the core provinces, and they've sacrificed a huge number. But I think the kind of, I think the political consensus that Putin is holding is that is that so far that Moscow and St. Petersburg have not been heavily impacted at this point, right?
Yes.
And so I think that could that's I think the political consensus that Putin is trying to hold, right? But eventually, I mean, he will have to increasingly draw on the large city population too, right? To fight the war.
So we have to think about the issue that Russia is a multicultural country. It's not homogeneous, like
Homogeneous.
homogeneous like Germany or something. This is a very mixed culture empire, and the most part of their country, it's not Russian, and there are a lot of in Asia, a lot of territories were being conquered and where other societies were living there. And for example, the Chinese, they lost some territories to the Russia in the past as well, and they want these areas back, also back. And so the Russians have to maintain stability in these areas as well. So they cannot go all in war like they say they would. And if you draw more and more foreign soldiers from the countrysides and so on, at some points, these people won't serve because of the weakness of the central government. And this is a fear that the Putin government have to challenge at that point right now in the war. He cannot maintain this war infinitely as well in this regards. Also, I think we could argue with that issue as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so that's why that Ukraine hopefully holds out. Yeah, I mean, so I think the Western case of support for Ukraine, I think, is in my view, I mean, it's unambiguous. Even though, I mean, we have a lot of people within the U.S. camp that are isolationist and want to end this war. And the same thing, like Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany and people like that. But I think, Israel is a little bit more complex, right? Because I think that the U.S. should provide the cover to Israel, if they are being attacked, right? But then with regard to like how they respond, so everything that they have done since the October 7th terrorist attack, right, where it's basically, we have, the Israelis say, well, they have to lash out more and more, right? So first they lashed out against, Gaza, which has already been mostly destroyed, right? Using American weapons, to be clear, and then now, the same thing is happening in southern Lebanon. And now they're, obviously they're fighting in Syria, they're fighting the Houthis. And and they're lashing out in all kinds of directions. And my worry is that, I mean, in any war, you've got the escalatory logic, right? Because, you're giving the other side the excuse to, keep hitting you. And then the other thing, I mean, the domestic politics in Israel, right? Where if you think about it, like right before October the 7th, right? Netanyahu was about to be ousted, right? There was a lot of, anti-Netanyahu protests. He was an authoritarian ruler. Right now, he's part of this. He's leading this emergency cabinet, right, during the period of war, and it seems to me like, Netanyahu can keep himself in power as long as the war is going on, and that to me sounds like a terrible incentive, right?
Yeah.
Where also like the people that are supporting him within the coalition government. Like, his national security minister, his defense minister, who come from kind of the right wing of Israeli politics, which are basically the people who say that, the entire territory of historic Palestine, right? So all of this are Israel, West Bank and Gaza, should belong to Israel, right?
Yeah.
And we don't want to have to compromise at all about two-state solution, which you clearly cannot do. I mean, if you have half the population living there is Arab, right? Even if they killed already many Gazans. So it's a terrible situation politically, even for Israel itself. And I do think like the Israeli public, like at what point, like, do they dislike Netanyahu more than, I suppose, the terrorist threat from the outside, right?
I think at the point is when there is no existential threat to Israel anymore. Like, if there's no negotiation with Iran and so on, that they accept not to retaliate Israel in their political agenda anymore.
So you're saying that, there would have to be an end to whatever the Hezbollah and Iran and all of these forces to attack
Let's
Israel.
say the past, Egypt and Saudi Arabia was also enemies of Israel, but after the Yom Kippur War and so on, they could manage to keep in peace with those two countries, and now they are in some kind supporter of Israel. And if we can come to a point where the Houthi, the Lebanese, and the Iranians don't want to destroy Israel totally from the map anymore, we can talk about a peace deal where the Israeli people won't fear distinction more than having a president like Netanyahu, a minister president like Netanyahu anymore.
Yeah, so bring peace in the region.
Yeah, I think he plays with the fear of his people as well to keep him in power in some kind of way. But if they could manage to create a solution that they can live without fear of war, then it could change. Because the Israeli people, I think they can live together with the Arabics, because I think half of the population in Israel is Arabic origin, from Arabic origins, and they can live with them together in peace. There's no issue, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, ultimately, I mean, it's like these kinds of decisions, I mean, they're made on the politics side of things, which is to say, really, the Ayatollah in Iran and then I guess the Hezbollah chief who was recently assassinated. But basically, I mean, anybody that comes underneath those top political officers, because from their perspective, I think those Islamists, they derive the legitimacy from targeting Israel as a Jewish state, and it's quite ironic because you could make the argument that like all of the weapons that they're using to fight Israel, they're not using to develop their own economies, to make their own population healthier and wealthier and so forth. But again, I look at it from the psychological logic on the ground, right? So, if one side lobs the bombs on the other side, right? What's going to happen is a lot of civilian deaths, and then the people that survive it, they're going to be mobilizable by the terrorist forces, right? Because effectively they're like, well, okay, look, the Israelis destroyed your family, and and the way how you can get back at them is if you join our group, and we're going to give you the weapons, and we're going to give you the rockets, and then you can fire back at them. And that's the logic in which I think the Israelis are trapping themselves in. There's absolutely no foresight into the future regarding like how could you stop the further escalation, and the sad thing from the Western perspective is that again the US is not in the driver's seat. We kind of have to hope that things do not get even more out of hand. I can see why for the Russians it's beneficial, right? The Russian foreign minister going to Tehran. Because the Russians clearly want to split the attention of the West, right, of the US, between different theaters. I don't know. Broadly from the military historian viewpoint, don't you think that we are simply going back to the messy era, that's to say basically anything that happens during and before World War II, right? In the global order.
It's that way, but I don't think that is actually the case, because the world community after World War II has developed himself furthermore than the way of thinking in pre-World War II and World War One. Foreign policy is way of thinking, and we have like Germany and France was until the end of World War II were arch enemies, and if there was a possibility, they fought with each other, like the wars of 1770 to 71 or of World War. And all this generation told each other the other is the enemy, and so on and so forth. But after World War II, they have to accept that it cannot go further more this way, and they could create a peace and economic work together that lasts until today. And now Germany and France are the best friends in the European Union, for example. And if we watch to Israeli history, the point that Israel could create a lasting peace with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, I think it has the capability to create a lasting peace with the other countries as well, if they are willing to go to each other and create this peace, because this is possible, I think.
I mean, is the assumption that there would have to be regime change in Iran to some extent? I mean, yeah, again, because the Ayatollah's perspective is that basically, I mean,
Does it
their
have to
version of legitimacy is to be
change?
anti-U.S. and anti-Israel, right?
But does it have to be a regime change, or does it have to be a foreign policy relationship change only? Because the Saudi Arabians or the Egyptian government is, I think, still the same. The Saudi Arabia is still a monarchy and still the same ruling family, but the people who rules this country change in foreign policy issues for the better good.
So it is possible to have a forward-looking, friendly foreign policy towards Israel. Yeah, I mean, yeah, but we'll have to see, like, whether that kind of mental opening does exist. But again, well, so this is something that, again, the West cannot or should not influence or affect by force. I think we have seen time and again, like what happened in Libya, right, where there was a forceful overthrow of Gaddafi, right, in Iraq, right, Saddam Hussein. Then the Taliban, which I mean is the most embarrassing example for the West, right, because the Taliban were removed 20 years ago and now they're back again. So,
but I think the Taliban has changed. In my opinion, they are not so aggressive against Western countries anymore, like they were under Osama bin Laden, for example.
Well, I mean, Osama bin Laden, I mean, so he's a Saudi national and he had those, whatever terrorist training camps in Afghanistan, right? So the Taliban regime effectively was just giving him like space to do his activities. And yeah, I mean, so but even if the Taliban is not explicitly anti-Western, I mean,
right now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly, I mean, from the human rights discourse in the West, I mean, is kind of very concerned about what's happening in Afghanistan regarding women's rights, and the men have to grow their beard, and so Sharia law, right? So there are certainly concerns about that, but in terms of but I mean, if you follow this kind of Westphalian principle, which I think is a very good principle for conducting international affairs, where it's like, I mean, you could disagree as much as you want, like morally, regarding the interior policies of different countries, but you don't want to enforce regime change from the outside.
Yeah.
If it is done from the inside, I think then well, that's a different story. Then you might want to support that, and that's why, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I still have these debates about, like, Ukraine, and certainly because the pro-Russian narrative was basically that this was a CIA-led coup, right, attempt in Maidan in 2014, and that the natural pro-Russian sentiment of the Ukrainian people has been subverted by this coup attempt. I don't know. I mean, it's So I would say that the historic split between pro-Western Ukrainians and pro-Russian Ukrainians, I think prior to Maidan, I think this was a more serious kind of contest, right?
Yeah.
But I would say that after Putin dropped the mask, and when he took Crimea and he took part of the Donbass, I think that the that it's like if you look at like the Russian speakers in the east, so you have like Kharkiv Oblast, right? You have down south, you have Zaporizhia, you have Kherson, right? And even they became completely anti-Russian after the Crimea attack. So I would rather accept the kind of, you could say, the winners of that Maidan coup, right? Kind of like the pro-Western Ukrainian camp. Because their narrative is basically that, while it was their domestic-led coup, it was an expression of the plurality sentiment of the Ukrainian population. And then also, like, with regard to this, like, NATO argument, where yes, I mean the Ukrainians did put the NATO membership into the constitution, but again, that was after the Crimea invasion, right? So I mean, in terms of the timeline, I mean, it was the Russian aggression that started this all. And yeah, so I think the difficult case that has to be made is that I think that there's enough Ukrainian people who have knowledge about life in the West, right? By, for instance, working in Poland or in Germany or other places, and they know life can be better. It can be less corrupt. The institutions can work better for them, and GDP can be much higher, right? And I think that this is what the sentiment is in Ukraine.
Yeah, but this is a problem. I cannot give a total answer yet, because when I look back to history, we can, in which cases there was a successful regime change where old enemy become partners or friends. For example, we have in case the Japanese, after World War II, they went to the Western world and will become allied of the US and Germany as well. And all that has to do with GDP, I think, in many cases, except for China. Most countries where the US created alliances or trade agreements and helped to develop the countries and increase the GDP of these countries, they were much more stable and were influenced to the Western Hemisphere. What about politicians and so on? But only China, I think, they were profit. They get profit from the Western American trading and so on, but they keep themselves as a political enemy of the US. And I think most of the countries we could get to our favor if we help to develop their countries, because all these countries like Iran, Russia, and so on are this way, in my opinion, because they are poor in lots of ways, and they don't know that they are really poor.
Right.
If we could show them better lifestyle, it could change.
And the idea is that, so if you have like a, let's say, a poor society, that they are, much more receptive to, I call it like military feudalism, right? So, I mean, essentially the idea is that, we'll just have to, take on control more space in the other countries. That's the way how we can generate legitimacy. It is not through, an increase in the GDP per capita, right?
Yes.
It's just like we're grabbing the resources of the guy next door, right? That's, yeah. So I mean, so if you want to defeat that kind of logic, which I think, I think it's a terrible logic, obviously, because again, with war, I mean, there's so many people getting killed and stuff. So if do you then have to embrace this Washington consensus idea, right? Where, okay, well, everybody's going to become a neoliberal now. Everybody's going to introduce, the free market capitalism, and I mean, it has like it opens up another can of worms, because if you don't develop the economy in a somewhat balanced way, right? Where basically, I mean, what I mean by that is like, so you increase the private sector supply side economics, right? You increase the jobs, but then also, there's some amount of redistribution happening along the way, right? So there's always like a taxing of the successful people, and then you give it to the people that are less successful, and so that they can sort of develop the capacity, the human development, the human resources to develop. And you kind of do this gradually, and then, and then I think, successful economic development is going to happen. But it's not happening everywhere. I mean, clearly not, right? I mean, like Sub-Saharan Africa, I think, is probably a place where they struggle with that, right?
Yeah, but they are not developed enough, I would say. But as we see, the European Union is a very successful story in this case, that the Union puts money together to help undeveloped European countries to increase their wealth, and so we decrease the possibility for envy and war. And so this way of politician helped the European Union to keep the peace in Europe for more than one decade, more than 50 years.
Right.
I think that's a good way of how to deal with. I think war is a consequence of envy and misunderstanding in some way, that you want something from the other, like the Russians want the territory from the Ukraine, and so on. And if we minimize this enviness, we could create more space for peace.
Yeah. And that's generally, I think, also the logic of, you could say, democratically minded, compromise-oriented political leaders, right? And also a whole political culture that revolves around that. Yeah, we clearly don't have that in places like, Iran or North Korea, Russia, etc. So, yeah, but I think the overall sentiment of like, we want to expand, the democratic sphere gradually, and we want to expand wealth and opportunities. I think, I think ultimately, I mean, it is an extremely strong and enticing argument, and I have to give that to the kind of pro-development Western crowd, because I mean, you see this even in migration patterns, right? Where you see so many like Russian oligarchs who are buying property in Western Europe and in the US, right? And there's none of the Western oligarchs who care about, property in Moscow or anything like that, unless you're Trump who wants to get a Trump Tower built there or something. But
because that's not of ownership. You can get, if you buy a house in Russia, Putin, if he needed, he can take it away. That's a problem there, I think. That's why Chinese billionaires, if they can, they would put their money in the Western world instead of Chinese properties, if they can. I was reading past in 2010 or 8 or something that the Chinese government was allowed his people to invest in foreign countries and so on, and it did it a lot, and so they have to remove this allowance.
So right, because the idea for China right now is that you want to prevent the capital from flowing out of their country, and so, but that's why this authoritarian logic, I mean, is kind of like a death spiral logic, right? Where basically, I mean, so you start with some kind of economic crisis, right? Because they overinvested in the real estate sector, right? So house prices go down, people's wealth is tied up with the housing, so which means that consumption also goes down, right? Because people's wealth evaporates. And then you're going to have a legitimacy crisis, right? Because people are like, well, where's my job? Where's my income? And so then there's like more crackdown on like civil society. There's more crackdown on businesses for being like greedy hoarders and things like that, right? And not sharing the wealth. And then the rich people are like, well, okay, then I'm gonna need a second passport and I need to pull my assets out of the country, right? And then as the capital flight is happening, well, then the government then has to react to that by clamping down on the capital outflows. But then if you clamp down on the capital outflows, well, it sends a signal to all of the people with money that, well, now is the time to get out, right? Because I might not be able to do it in a year from now.
Would you say China is in the brink of a revolutionary time period? Like they cannot maintain, in my opinion, they cannot maintain this authoritarian regime as much longer as they do now. But also they have to balance between liberality and in their country and this authoritarian regime. And I don't think they can keep it that way for more longer, because with upcoming wealth, people want more rights in their own right in China as well.
Yeah, so there was this article by David Yang in the NBER, the economist at Harvard, and he talks about, he describes China as like authoritarianism 3.0, right? And so the third generation, the first generation was kind of like, I suppose, like the Maoist period, right? Where it was extraordinary repression, mixed with like poor economic development. And the second period was basically Deng Xiaoping until maybe the beginning of the Xi Jinping era, I would say, which is kind of like a little bit more like information openness, right? Exchange of ideas, rapid economic development, integration with the West, at least in terms of trade. And then the third generation, that so he surmises that it's kind of like going back to it'd be closer to what it was in the first generation, right? Because I mean, because if the economic gains are kind of slipping away, you're gonna have to get into a legitimacy crisis. Now in democratic countries, the legitimacy crisis is solved much easier because you just have elections, right?
Yes.
So every 4 or 5 years, you allow the people to let off some steam, right? Usually by voting for oftentimes right-wing populist forces, sometimes left populist, but mostly right. And then they do a poor job in government, and then you kick those people out too.
Yes.
Yeah. So in China this does not exist. So then basically then the lever is going to be more on the repression side of things. So you'd have to improve the surveillance systems, right? Like checking up on what people are saying and writing on the social media and things like that. And yeah, and so and also like you appeal to maybe patriotism and things like that, right? So
Yes,
there's other things that they can do, right?
but what I know about is the most successful area of the communist Chinese governmental time was the time when Deng Xiaoping come to power until, let's say, Xi Jinping, and this was the liberation time of the Chinese Communist Party, where they opened to the Western world and influenced by the Western world. The great companies of Europe and US came to their country and helped to develop the technologies, and the wealth is increasing. And nowadays they went national directive that the Western world is a social enemy or economic enemy of China. And since that, we have a lot of inner crisis in China, like the unemployment rate of over 20 to 30%, the youth, and or the finance crisis of buildings and some of capital and buildings and so on. And these, I think, are very hard issues that the government cannot maintain, cannot handle with this kind of regime. And therefore, I think this would be a downfall in maybe 30, 40, 50 years. Because the wealth of the Chinese people is high enough that they want more liberties nowadays. Not, and you cannot restrict this with nationalism anymore, like when they were poor. Because opinion, even Germany, the people who say I am for me it's important to be a German or I'm a nationalist are mostly the people who don't have good jobs or are poor, and then they stick to these ideas of group ideas.
Yeah, but then again, if you talk about like the economic declines that are happening, I mean, isn't it the case that you nibble at the size of that middle class, right? That aren't you gradually shifting more and more people from the middle class column into the working poor column, right? And then so then I think that there's going to be a larger share of the population that will be receptive to nationalistic messaging. And then the question is, I mean, what does nationalism entail? I mean, is it only about flag waving, which I think sounds quite innocuous to me, or is it about invading Taiwan and seeing whether there are more options to secure sea route access through the Pacific? And this is, I mean, this is kind of the the big issue at this point. And look, I mean, as long as the Taiwan war is not broken out, I think I mean, like we obviously have to plot and think about that scenario, but as long as this has not happened, I'm like, okay, there's still the conflict in Asia is still conflict potential is still contained. So it won't be a hot war like we're seeing in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe. Now again, it could get there in in a moment's notice.
I think I don't take this risk so seriously, like in Iran and Israel war, or the war going on Ukraine in Asia, because of the wealth of China. I don't think that the Chinese government or people are likely to go to war so easily, like the Russians and the Iranians. And one of the reasons why I think that is because of the wealth of China in these days.
Right. Right. I mean, the official Chinese government strategy to basically restore economic health is to maximize export, right? So so they're dominating with solar panel production, with electric vehicles, with smartphones, basically all kinds of gadgets. And now the Western countries are reacting to that because they're saying, hang on a minute, we don't want to undermine our own industries here. And so, there's more protectionism, there's more tariffs. So there's definitely more barriers in the 2020s for the Chinese to drive a export-led economic model compared to 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right?
Yes, what's has something to do with the wealth as an explanation of war riskiness, because when was China going to war in the past during the Communist Party leadership? This was at the beginning of their governmentalship. In Vietnam was in the 70s, 80s, and the war in North Korea and so on. And there, an issue, there was the most of the population in China was very poor at that time.
So you have like this deprivation to war thesis, right? So
yeah,
yeah, it's an interesting thesis, quite workable. I mean, you might say that Nazi Germany's rise. I mean, there was a heavy industrial period in Germany, right, between the unification in 1871 until I suppose basically until the Great Depression, really, right, 1929, 30. And then it was really that crunch period, right, between 29 and 33, really, right, which brought the Nazis from being a modular party to being plurality party. Yeah, so and actually, I mean, that's a cautionary tale, because I mean, the Weimar Republic, I mean, it was a democracy, right? So you let in Hitler through the front door, effectively, right?
yes.
Through democratic elections. And I don't know. I mean, it's like, I mean, can a democracy be ever fully consolidated in that sense? Because I would say that, like, 3 years ago with January 6th, I mean, we're like one of the core democracies in the world, right? I mean, it was kind of like it was just an inch away from losing that way, right? Losing its way, right?
I mean the capital, the rise.
The capital attack, yeah. And so, I mean, so basically, I mean, so I think that many countries are fragile, I would say.
Yes.
Even the so-called consolidated, democracies are in some sense going to be fragile. In Europe, I mean, you have high amount of wealth, which is true, but it's largely been stagnant, right? For the last 20 years or so, right? So kind of the economic development is mostly going sideways. I mean, there's some small increases because you still let in like immigration from Middle East, North Africa, and other places. But certainly, per capita GDP is mostly going sideways. If you look like the Brexit vote in the UK, right? I mean, it's kind of the most deprived economic regions that are voting pro-Brexit. And actually, after Brexit, their economy is even worse now, right?
Of course. But I think this has happened because of right wings who said we are. It's something different if a country is really poor and if we think it is poor, because Germany, for a fact, it's one of the richest countries in the world. We can agree to that. But in the last few decades, the right wings politicians in Germany make up the idea that we are decreasing and our wealth is decreasing because the wealth is pointing to a low number of rich people, and the majority of the people are getting more poor and poor and poor. And this is maybe one issue why we have this national problems in the Western countries and in the US as well, because the US is very rich. It is definitely the richest country in the world, but with the propaganda of Donald Trump and so on, maybe a lot of people think the wealth don't get a share value of the wealth this country increase, and then they radicalize in this way.
Well, I mean, there's some truth to that statement, though. I mean, it cannot be, entirely dismissed, right? There is relative deprivation, and also I think the psychological concept of loss aversion is very important, right? Which is to say that, if you lose a little bit of money, it hurts you much more than the happiness you get from gaining a little bit of money, right?
Yes.
So and so that suggests that, like, so if there are people who, like, let's say in sociology we look at intergenerational mobility, right? If it goes down, then people are going to be much more willing to listen to, like, the Trumpist or the Wagenknecht AfD message, right? And also, like, in East Germany, I mean, there is, in comparative perspective, yeah, I mean, there's deprivation, right? Because the East Germans are probably comparing themselves with the West Germans instead of the Poles and the Czechs, right?
Yes.
Even though, I mean, within the East Bloc, I mean, yes, I mean, East Germany was the most developed, right? But yeah, I mean, if the reference value is West Germany, and they're like, well, okay, our pensions are lower, our wages are lower, unemployment is higher, right? So I think that is a form of relative deprivation, right?
Yeah, this is what I say with when I say envy of wealthness that leads to conflict. I think Germany nowadays has a very great conflict potential because of the less development of Eastern Germany compared to Western Germany, and they have a complex city that they say we are ruled by the Western, we are occupied by the Western, we are not united anymore in that way, and that is what divides a lot of Germans, I think, nowadays.
And again, there's some basis for that. So at the beginning of the unification, so I think in the early 1990s, there were a lot of West Germans, who took leadership positions in, like, East German universities and civil service, and like the judgeships and so forth, right? Yeah. And because they say, well, we have to make those institutions ready for like the federal democratic system, right? but in that way, I mean, you do feel marginalized. If you grew up in East Germany, you're just like, yeah, okay, you know, these are, you know, foreign occupation forces that are coming to, you know, take our jobs and privileges away, right, from us. And I don't know how better you would handle this thing, because I mean, I think the kind of the German political elites reflex would be to say, you know, well, look at the you know, subsidies that the West German states have paid to the East, right, which are substantial, you know, to you know, modernized infrastructure and all these things. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe, you know, these kinds of adjustment processes, I mean, they would have to take much longer. You know, we'd have to go probably into, you know, several generations, and hopefully then the gap will narrow, right?
Yes, but we went back to the issues why we have conflicts. Is probably, I think that because the division of poor and rich in all developed countries gets worse in some way of kind. Like in the US, a lot of areas are not continuing the development that the US is going, like Montana or the countries in the middle of the US. They feel left alone, and then they vote for Trump because of these narratives of nationalism. In I think, and in my opinion, in all developed countries, if you don't share your wealth equally to the people, you get unrest in some way. Like in China nowadays, in Europe, a little bit less than in the US, but still existent.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and unfortunately, I think that the distributional conflicts are going to get worse. I mean, it's not just because of, you know, what Marx described as, like, you know, the private property relationship inherent to capitalism, which I think is a big part of it too. But I think also, like, climate change, right? Which I think I think it's going to induce scarcities in ways that, you know, we can currently not imagine, right? Because I mean, look, I mean, the amount of destruction that is, you know, added on to our infrastructure, right? Like we have, you know, in Western North Carolina, we have basically entire villages, towns are wiped out because of the floods. You know, we had something similar happening, I think, in close to Vienna in Austria, then in the Czech Republic, Poland, right, recently. And you see this in so many places around the world, all happening around the same time. And I think, you know, and it's just going to escalate in the latter. And it's like, okay, you're going to be spending, you know, several hundreds of billions to repair each time, right? You know, what is the, you know, what is a civilizational breaking point, I suppose, is a big question.
We could try to answer this question next time then, about the economic influence of nature crisis into our society as well.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I'll then call the podcast an end, and thank you very much, Hoang, for being here.
It was a pleasure for me as well. Thank you for this conversation. I had a